For a decade, he has been the person inspecting the province's books, ensuring Ontarians are getting good value for the tax dollars that their government spends. His most recent report focused on the $275 million price tag taxpayers will shell out for the cancellation of a partially built gas plant in Mississauga leading up to the 2011 election. But now, he's retiring. So with that, we welcome Jim McCarter, the departed Auditor General of Ontario, as of yesterday, right?
Yeah, and it's good to be back on the agenda, Steve.
Nice to have you here. Well, I do want to start talking about this Mississauga report, which was your last very high-profile report, and then we'll broaden out and talk more about your career. Just tell us off the top, what was the objective of that report?
Essentially, the Standing Committee on Public Accounts that I report to, they passed a motion. Actually, all three parties supported it. And what the motion basically said is they said, Auditor, what's the bottom line? What is the true cost of cancelling and relocating the Mississauga Power Plant?
Because we've seen lots of different numbers.
Exactly. As you know, the government basically came out, the Minister of Energy at that time, Chris Bentley, came out and he said it's $190 million. When we did our work, we actually disagreed. We had a somewhat higher number. We felt, as you indicated in your introduction, we felt the cost to the public would be about $275 million.
How'd you get there?
Basically, we're looking at a number of things. The direct costs, for instance, they paid $150 million to a U.S. hedge fund. There was about $110 million to suppliers. They had to settle some existing lawsuits. And then there's some future costs down the road, for instance, because you have to bring the power from down near Sarnia to the more populated centers like the GTA. There's a line loss. So there's a cost associated with that. But we also found some offsetting savings. So there was about 10 or 12 different things that kind of, were involved in that, upgrading some transformers. And there were some things actually we looked at and we spent a fair bit of time on that actually didn't turn out to have any impact. For instance, do you need more transmission lines? We actually found we didn't. But at the end of the day, we felt the 275 was a pretty reasonable estimate. Now, one thing I know for sure, it won't be exactly 275 million, but that's in the ballpark.
How much of that has been paid out already?
They paid out about 270 million of that has been paid out, and I think they've got about another 5 or 10 million to pay out, and the rest of it will be more. It's going to be included in our electricity bills over the next 20 years, and we did something. We present valued that back to today's dollars, but so a big chunk of it's going to be paid by the taxpayers, and that's where the $190 million come. Is basically the government said we're going to have $190 million are going to be paid by the taxpayers. Really, anything over and above that is going to be paid by you and I, the electricity ratepayers.
The Liberal Minister of Energy said $190 million. You did your investigation and you said $275 million. In the course of your investigation, did you find any evidence that suggested that the Liberals knowingly lowballed the cost of this?
Probably the best way I can answer that is that, I don't know, and it was the Ontario Power Authority that was managing all this. They had all the numbers. And I don't know what they told the Minister of Energy or what they told the Ministry of Energy. But what I do know is in early January last year, when the minister came out and he said it was $190 million, we know that the OPA knew at that time that they'd actually had hard payments to the hedge fund. They'd paid suppliers. They had already paid about $270 million. So at that time, they knew they were going to have those payments.
Now, whether they told the minister
or not, I don't know what they told the minister, but they knew that. Maybe they felt the savings would be bigger than they were, but we do know that they did know that when the minister made the announcement.
I know that through the course of your 10 years, you have tried to what's the best way to say it? Expand the mandate of the Auditor General's office, not just to sort of follow the money, but also see whether we got value for the money expended. So I wonder whether part of your mandate for this study was to say whether it was appropriate for the Premier to have canceled this in the dying days of an election campaign to save seats in Mississauga.
I think in hindsight, I think all three parties have basically said we would have canceled the Mississauga Power Plant. And I think the Premier and the government's come out and said, I wish we would have done this, recognized this sooner. But again, it clearly was a political decision. I think everybody's recognized it was not the bureaucracy that did this. It was clearly a political decision. They've acknowledged that. To some extent, I guess from the auditor's perspective, we don't really wade in on what's a good policy or what's a bad policy. I know we've been on before talking about the green energy. And so it's not up to the auditor to say green energy is good or to bad. It's really just for us to come out and say, here's what it cost.
And the provincial budget comes out tomorrow. Do you want your report on the Mississauga gas plant to be influential in that budgetary thing?
You know, it's hard to say how it'll impact the budget. I think what the government said is that we've taken what we think are the cost to the taxpayers, the $190 million, and I think they've got a figure for Oakville of $40 million. As you may know, we're also actually in now looking at Oakville because the Premier did write to us shortly after she was elected as the leader, asking us to go into and have a look at the Oakville.
And
so we're doing that.
It's not going to be 40 either, is it?
It's not going to be. Who knows?
It's not going to be 40. We know that.
Ask me in 3 or 4 months, and I'll.
Okay. All right. Let's. Okay. Enough on Mississauga. I want to broaden out now and talk about your career because you have had some defining moments in Ontario political history as a result of some of the work you've done. For example, you investigated Orange, the air ambulance situation, and I want to know just how easy or hard was it for you as the auditor to get the information you needed so that you could give the public the information it needed?
Yeah, that's it's interesting you picked that one because I'd have to say, in my tenure as the Auditor General, we've probably done, I'm guessing, 150 of these special and value for money audits. Probably if I could call it an auditee that we've had the most problem with getting information, really getting access to everything, and they refused to give us access to a number of things, and we reported that. I'd have to say Orange is probably top of my list. But again, you know, we persevered, and at the end of the day, I think we had a pretty hard-hitting report. We had some serious concerns at Orange.
Who's the they at Orange who wouldn't give you what you needed?
Basically, it was senior management that was led by the CEO, Dr. Chris Mazza, and it was very much, they took a very much a legalistic approach. As to, you know, every time we were asking for a document or asking to see a marketing agreement, they'd end up checking with their lawyers. They'd be bringing their lawyers, almost a team of lawyers, into meetings with us. And quite frankly, that we find that very unusual. And from my perspective, when my staff tells me that, it's like waving the red flag at the bull. You know, I'm immediately starting to pay a lot more attention to that file. I'm walking down the hall, you know, a couple of times a week wanting to know what's happening. So it probably did the reverse impact of what they would have liked it to have done. But it was a complex audit.
But we've seen in hindsight, they ran that like they thought it was a private company. And of course, you regarded it as an agency of the Ontario government. So would that difference in interpretation as to what they were account for their secretiveness?
I think in their eyes, perhaps in the eyes of the beholder, I think in their eyes, they felt that, yes, we're independent. I think we looked at it, listen, you're being literally 100% funded by the taxpayers. You have an obligation to make sure that you're spending the taxpayer money basically cost effectively and not running off doing all these private sector ventures. We had a pretty strong opinion on that. We also, there's been still hearings going on at the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, and I know the Public Accounts Committee members, they're also very concerned, as we were, about, you know, whether the board, you know, did you guys undertake your fiduciary responsibility, and did you do the job you were doing overseeing these people?
One of the other biggies you did over the last few years was look into e-health, because we heard the allegation over and over and over again that we put $1 billion in and it was all blown. 3 years later, did we blow $1 billion on e-health?
You know, I probably have a similar answer that I had back in 2009, was that we didn't blow $1 billion, but we certainly did not get value for money for at least hundreds of millions of dollars, and I think the same conclusion holds true today. I mean, they've gone off and they've started to develop a diabetes registry and different things, but to be honest, we didn't get a lot of value for $1 billion. We got some value, but there's certainly hundreds of millions of dollars that were not well spent.
Now, Orange and e-health were not actually, how do I put this? They're not actually government departments, they're agencies of the government, so if you like, one step removed. You also, of course, throughout your career, audited actual ministries within the government of Ontario. Who's easier to get information out of?
I would say it probably depends on the auditee, but I'd say normally ministries, deputy ministers are just used to dealing with us. We're coming in. And so, I mean, most of the deputies I know pretty well now, and they know if they see in their call display Jim McCarter, the Auditor General, it's not usually good news.
They're not taking the call.
So yeah. But I'd say Orange was a rare circumstance. I'd say of the 150 audits, I'd say there'd be no more than 10 that I've had, say, challenges getting, you know, reasonable access to information, maybe 8 or 10.
So government departments get that you're going in there and looking at what they do is part of the deal. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I'd have to say it. They had a very nice last week. They had a very nice kind of retirement reception for me at the legislature. And in my closing remarks, after the speakers all said nice things about the auditor, which is very unusual. There's a number of deputy ministers there, and I did say that actually the deputy minister community, we don't always agree. They're probably not happy to see me, but at the end of the day, they really do respect the role that we have to play. And I think they would probably agree at the end of the day, it's probably a useful role. And at the end of the day, you know what? The auditor made some good recommendations, and we're probably running a lot of our programs better because of that.
Well, in fairness to them, when you show up, as you say, it's not with good news. You're basically there to tell them how to do their jobs better. What percentage of your recommendations do you think eventually get picked up and implemented?
My sense would be probably 3/4 would be fully implemented. And there's some of the recommendations that they're pretty complex and they could take, really a number of years to implement fully. I'd say that there's another 15 or 20% that get implemented. But on the other hand, there's probably 5% that maybe don't get implemented. And I guess I'd be concerned if every one get implemented, because I really do want the deputies to stand back and some of them will say, you know what, Auditor, we really have to assess the pros and cons of this. And that's really what we want them to do. Do a good business case, assess the pros and cons, and maybe, instead of going this way, they'll zig that way a little bit. But at the end of the day, we've had pretty good success. And the other big benefit that I have is I have the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. And they call the deputies in, or the university presidents or the hospitals in for a hearing. And that has, how should I say, a very encouraging effect in getting them to implement our recommendations.
Well, they grill them, don't they?
Yes.
On camera.
They do. They do. And that's very helpful to us to have a strong legislative committee kind of, backing us up.
I want to ask you about, I guess this happened on your watch. When Dalton McGuinty took over in 2003, he passed a new law, his government passed a new law, saying that before every election, the Auditor General's got to look at the books and basically sign off on the veracity of the province's fiscal position. Is that a power that you wanted?
And it actually goes further than that. It's they basically come out with what they think the surplus or deficit's going to be for the current fiscal year, but they also have to project it 2 years in the future. So what they're really doing is saying, we think this is the state of the fiscal nation. And I remember when the minister phoned me up, I think it was Greg Sabera at that time, and said, well, what do you think about this, Jim? Like, normally we auditors, we're very conservative people. We like to audit things that have already happened. In this case, we're actually opining on the future. So what I said to him is, as I said, Greg, I said, Minister, as long as we can word it that we're kind of opining on the reasonableness of it, I said, I think it's a great accountability measure to come out before the election and tell the public this is where we stand. And, I think they felt, well, nobody's going to believe us. So what we're going to do is we're going to have the Auditor General look at it. I just think it's a great accountability measure.
So is it impossible now for governments to fudge the books on the eve of an election?
It's a lot more difficult.
So not impossible, though.
You know what? They can fudge it a little bit, but if they get out too far, like on the last pre-election review we did, we basically said we think revenues are reasonable. I mean, could they have it 0.1% higher than maybe they thought they might have? On the expenditure side, we come out, we basically said, I think the words I used were kind of pie in the sky in some of the stuff, in the sense that it was much too aggressive. What they were coming out and saying, here's how we're going to cut all these expenses, but not reduce services. So I think it's just good information for the public, and you have to give them credit for giving this information to the public, and then they put it out there, and then they have to wait to see what the auditor's going to say, and it can be good news, but it can be bad news.
Well, after being the spending watchdog for 10 years, you would like to think that government spends our tax dollars more carefully, intelligently, wisely today than they did 10 years ago. Can you, in fact, say that?
I think that there's a number of programs that we've gone back into that I'd have to say we've seen an improvement, but the one area that I indicated in my 10th annual report that I tabled in December, the one thing that they still need to do a better job on is on some of these major big dollar decisions. They need to do what I call doing their homework. They need to do, underlying analysis, do a business case, get the data, and so that you're making a decision based on hard information. If there's any one area that I'd sort of say on a go-forward basis, that's what you got to pay attention to, that would be it.
I want to, let's play some tape from somebody you know. Here's Sheila Fraser, who, of course, was the Auditor General of Canada. Sponsorship scandal was unveiled on her watch. And she became a bit of a superstar in the public's mind because of
exactly. Yes,
her watching the public purse. Here's, let's play this tape, then we'll come back and chat. Control room, roll this if you would.
There have been a few occasions where actually we thought that the audits were pretty positive. But as you know, probably better than I, positive stories don't get headlines.
So which one?
Well, I think there were a number of them. I remember one on immigration controls, and there was a small little piece in there about how they needed to do more work on medical surveillance of people coming into the country, and that became the big story. And to us, it was kind of it was a less important issue.
Footnote for you, but a big deal for others. So let me ask you whether that kind of thing happened on your watch, where the media may have taken something that you reported and really torqued it up and made something out of it that wasn't completely there.
I'd have to say, for the most part, I deal quite a bit with the Queen's Park media, and I'd have to say that over the years, I find that they reflect what I tell them. I think they do a good job. Admittedly, the adjectives sometimes they use, it seems every auditor's report is a scathing report. So I'd have to say maybe some of the adjectives that they use, but overall, the general context, the main message, I think they do a pretty darn good job of communicating it, fairly. I would agree with Sheila, though. I mean, every year at my press conference, sort of 2/3 of the way through the press conference, I say, the government does a lot of good things, and I always rhyme off 5 of them. And literally, Steve, it's like as soon as I say this, I'm going to tell you 5 good things. It's like the eyes roll and the pens go down, and they wait till the auditor's finished with that.
They don't want to know. No, good news doesn't get reported. Well, here's, let me quote a couple of the guys who I think you know along the way. Here's what Adam Radwanski had to say about your pre-election report in the Globe and Mail. Unlike Ontario's Ombudsman, André Marin, Auditor General Jim McCarter does not have a habit of slapping attention-grabbing titles on his work. And then Alan Carter, writing 2 weeks ago for Global News Online about your decade of service, said this: each time, his deep knowledge and even tone transformed a scandal into a shaming by virtue of his integrity and refusal to lower himself to cheap shots. We've had André Marin on this program before, and we've had lots of people talk about the kind of job he does. And he does kind of, how do you want to characterize it, Mr. McCarter? The way he does what he does versus how you do what you do.
My sense is that I think each officer does the job the best way they see fit. And I think André, and I know André fairly well, he's got his style, and I have to confess, I probably have a bit of a different style than André. And it's just how each of us approach the job.
Would you say he goes over the top in a way that you don't?
I think...
You're being so careful here, aren't you? You're just trying to be such a nice guy.
I'm just trying to... I think probably he's a little more willing to be more, how would I say, some have said media savvy. I'm probably fairly... I'm probably fairly careful about trying to put things in the right context, and you want to make sure that the story's not about you and the story's about the story.
The allegation about him is that he's a bit of a media show-off in a way that you're not, and therefore you have added credibility. You want to sign on to that?
My sense is that I think the reason that very often it seems to be every time there's a topical issue that comes up, whether it's the power plants, whether it's the divestiture of Ontario Northland, most recently it's the racetrack thing, it seems that every time something's coming up that's a high-profile thing, the first call in the legislature is get the Auditor General in there. And what I'm finding, too, is that often it's not just the 2 opposition parties that will support that, but often the government is coming on side. And, I'm hopeful that what it is at least we're going to get an objective, fair reporting from the Auditor General. We may not like what he has to say, or we may like what he has to say, and that's typically in the eye of the beholder. But I'm hopeful at the end of the day they would look at our office and say, you know what, we're going to get a fair, objective reporting, no grandstanding, this is the way it is. What's the bottom line, Auditor? $275 million.
Gotcha. We got a minute left here. What are you going to do now? How old are you, incidentally?
I am 61.
Well, you're way too young to do nothing, so what are you going to do now?
You know what? I've had a lot of people ask me that. One thing I'm not going to do is I've had a couple of firms say, well, would you be interested in doing sort of consulting work for us, given your background? But I'm very concerned about doing anything partisan, and because we do so much work in the office across the whole broader public sector, including hospitals, universities, I'm not going to do any consulting work. I've kind of said if there's something that's interprovincial or out of province, I might think about it. No full-time job. I've got a committee I'm doing with the Chartered Accountants Institute right now. Interestingly, one of the things that Sheila Fraser had said to me over breakfast a while ago is she's actually serving on a couple of boards of directors, and she said of all the things she's doing, she said, I'm really finding that interesting, Jim. And so that was one of the things she said you might want to look into. So, for the first couple of months, I'm going to do some traveling. I'm going to just to have some free time. But everybody that I talk to says, McCarter, you've gone at such a pace for 10 years. you're going to say that, but you're going to find after 3 or 4 months, maybe you're going to look up and say, maybe I should be doing something. So I guess we'll see where it goes, Steve.
I got an idea. Might be an election in the province soon. Why don't you run?
People have mentioned that to me too, but as I said, I've got to be very careful. I've always been nonpartisan, and that would certainly be a partisan decision.
It would indeed. Do you have any partisan feelings at all?
No, as a matter of fact, I probably shouldn't admit this, but I will. I don't even vote during the elections. I don't vote in the federal. I don't vote in the provincial elections. The reason being is I really do want to be nonpartisan. So I don't even exercise my democratic right and vote. And you could argue both sides of that, but that's my view.
But guess what? Next election, you won't have this job that you used to have, so you can vote. So tell us now, Kathleen Wynne, Tim Hudak, Andrea Horwath, who are you going to vote for?
Well, if I decide to vote, I guess I would assess their policies and see which one is closest to my personal views. And how's that for a non-answer?
That is no fun at all. Jim McCarter, it's good of you to spend so much time with us at TVO. We've always appreciated your visits over the years. And congrats on a heck of a good run as AG of Ontario.
Well, it's been good over the years, Steve. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.